The medical report confirms it, sir. It's advanced stage Huntington's disease. There is currently no cure. We need to start managing the symptoms immediately.
The monitor beeped twice before the doctor turned it off completely. Wonbin sat with his spine straight, hands folded on his knee, the posture of a man who had negotiated life and death for 2 decades and refused to let either see him flinch. Across the desk, the neurologist slid a folder toward him instead of speaking the words out loud, as if paper could soften what a voice could not. An autoimmune condition, the doctor finally said.
Rare.
It attacks the nervous system slowly. There's treatment. There's no promise. Wonbin didn't touch the folder. How long before it becomes visible to others? Months. Maybe less if you don't rest. Then I won't rest, Wonbin said, and stood, buttoning his jacket as though the conversation had been about the weather. He walked out of the private hospital wing the same way he walked into every room that mattered, shoulders back, expression unreadable, 2 bodyguards trailing 3 steps behind. Nobody in the hallway would have guessed that the man passing them had just been told his own body was turning against him. He had built an empire on the principle that weakness gets discovered and exploited. He intended to die before he let anyone see this particular weakness. By the time his car pulled through the gates of his mansion, he had already decided. No one would know. Not his men. Not his rivals. Not a single soul. He stood in the middle of his own hallway that night, surrounded by rooms he had bought and furnished and never once felt at home in, and understood something he had spent years avoiding, that a man could win every fight in the world and still lose to something as quiet as silence. He didn't yet know that the one person who would find out first was already on her way to interview for the housekeeping position his retiring housekeeper had insisted she take. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos, because this story only gets more emotional from here. Bianca had learned to read a room within seconds of entering it, a skill sharpened by years of walking into places where she didn't yet know if she'd be welcome. She stood at the servants' entrance of the mansion, straightened the collar of her blouse, and rehearsed the same sentence she always rehearsed before a job interview. I am dependable. I am hardworking. My son is my whole world, and he will never be a problem for you. Daniel, 8 years old and endlessly curious, had wanted to come with her. She'd left him instead with a neighbor, promising him rice and stew if he behaved. The retiring housekeeper, a woman with kind eyes and tired hands, met her at the door. He's not an easy man, the housekeeper warned quietly, glancing over her shoulder as though the walls themselves might report back to him. He doesn't talk much. He doesn't like questions. But he pays fairly, and he's never once raised his voice at me in 9 years. I don't need him to talk, Bianca said. I need him to trust me enough to let me do my job. The housekeeper studied her for a long moment, then smiled the way people smile when they've made a decision they already know is right. I think you'll do more than that. Bianca didn't tell her how badly she needed this position, or how many doors had already closed on her that month. Being a single mother in a city that measured a woman's worth by the ring on her finger meant explaining herself constantly, to landlords who assumed she couldn't pay, to schools that assumed her son would be a problem, to employers who assumed a woman raising a child alone had nothing left to give at work. She had learned to stop explaining. She simply worked twice as hard and let the results speak instead. It had cost her sleep, friendships, and more than a few nights crying quietly after Daniel had gone to bed so he'd never see it. But it had also taught her something she carried into every new job like armor. Nobody was coming to rescue her, so she would build the life she wanted with her own 2 hands. Walking home that evening, she allowed herself a small, cautious hope. A steady wage. A roof that didn't leak. Maybe for the first time in years, a little room to breathe. If you're enjoying this story so far, tap that like button and drop a quick comment letting us know what you think is going to happen next. We read every single one. The first time Bianca saw Wonbin, he was standing at the far end of a hallway lined with paintings worth more than she would earn in a lifetime, and he did not turn to greet her. You're the new one, he said, without inflection. Bianca, she answered. I'll be handling meals, laundry, and the general upkeep of the house, sir. I don't require conversation. Understood. He walked away without another word, and Bianca stood there a moment unbothered. She had faced colder rooms than this. She got to work. Within her first week, she noticed things the housekeeper hadn't mentioned, not because the woman had missed them, but perhaps because after 9 years, she'd stopped seeing them as unusual. Wonbin's plates came back to the kitchen barely touched. He gripped the staircase railing on his way up, subtly, like a man testing whether his legs would hold. Some mornings, his hands trembled around his coffee cup before he forced them still. Bianca said nothing about it. She simply began leaving denser, easier meals, soups, things that required little chewing and less effort, and made sure water was always within his reach, refilled before he had to ask. He noticed. He said nothing either. 2 weeks in, she found him sitting on the floor of his study at 8 in the morning, his cane knocked just out of reach, jaw clenched against a pain he refused to name. She didn't rush to him with panic in her voice, the way people do when they want credit for caring. She simply walked over, picked up the cane, and set it in his hand. "Would you like tea before or after you pretend this didn't happen?" she asked. For the first time since she'd arrived, Wonbin almost smiled. "After," he said. Daniel came into the mansion 3 weeks later, on a day when Bianca had no one to watch him and swallowed her pride enough to ask permission. She expected refusal. She got silence, which she'd learned by then was Wonbin's version of agreement. The boy was shy at first, hovering near his mother's skirt, sneaking glances at the tall, serious man who owned more rooms than Daniel had ever seen in his life. But children have a talent adults lose, the ability to see past reputation into whatever is sitting quietly underneath it. By the end of the afternoon, Daniel was showing Wonbin a drawing of a dragon, insisting the wings weren't crooked, they were dynamic. Wonbin studied the drawing with the same seriousness he gave to business contracts. "The wings are crooked," he said, "but the dragon looks like it could still win a fight." Daniel beamed like he'd been given a medal. That night, after Daniel had fallen asleep on the sofa and Bianca carried him gently to the car, Wonbin stood at the window and watched them leave, something unfamiliar sitting in his chest. He didn't have a name for it yet. He only knew the house felt hollow again the moment their car disappeared past the gate. Months passed the way seasons do, quietly, until one day you look up and everything has changed shape. Wonbin kept his appointments now, not because he wanted to, but because Bianca had a way of asking that made refusal feel childish. "You survived a boardroom of men who wanted you dead," she told him once, arms crossed, "but you're afraid of a blood test?" He went. His color improved. His appetite returned in small measures. He laughed, rarely, and only ever around Daniel, but he laughed. He began doing small things he never explained. New shoes appeared at Daniel's school locker after his old ones fell apart. A scholarship fund quietly opened in the boy's name at his school, routed through a lawyer so that no name could be traced back to the mansion. When Bianca asked her employer directly if he knew anything about it, he only said, "Strange," and changed the subject. She wasn't fooled. She never said so. His men noticed the change in him too, though none dared comment on it directly. His second-in-command remarked once, carefully, that the boss seemed less likely to threaten to throw a chair across the room during meetings. Careful, Wonbin warned, but there was no venom in it anymore. It wasn't only his temper that had softened. He found himself ending meetings earlier than he used to, eager to get home before Bianca finished for the day. He caught himself, more than once, checking his watch not out of impatience with business, but because he wanted to know how many hours remained before he'd hear Daniel's voice in the hallway again. For a man who had once measured his days entirely in leverage and profit, it was an unsettling, almost embarrassing thing to notice about himself. Bianca's friends noticed something too, the way she talked about her employer differently now, less like a job and more like a person she thought about outside of work hours. "You light up when you talk about him," her closest friend teased one evening, over cups of tea that had gone cold from talking too long. "Does the intimidating Mafia boss know he's turning into a soft-hearted man?" "He's not soft," Bianca said too quickly. "He's just tired of being alone. There's a difference." "Is there?" Bianca didn't answer. She didn't trust herself to. Neither of them spoke the truth sitting quietly between them, not Bianca, not Wonbin. Some fears are louder in silence than they would ever be out loud. Alone in her small apartment at night, Bianca argued with herself in ways she never said aloud. He is your employer. He is a dangerous man with a dangerous life. Daniel needs stability, not a man whose enemies could knock on their door one day. Every reasonable thought she built collapsed the moment she remembered the way he'd looked at Daniel's crooked dragon, or the quiet patience he showed her when the world had taught her to expect none. Wonbin fought a version of the same war. He had spent his life believing that attachment was a liability, a lever his enemies could pull. Caring about someone meant giving them the power to destroy you. And yet here he was, rearranging his schedule around a housemaid's visits, memorizing a boy's favorite snack, feeling something dangerously close to peace for the first time since before his diagnosis. He told himself it would pass. It didn't. The knock on Bianca's door came on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day that gives no warning before it changes everything. She opened it expecting a neighbor. She found Michael instead, older, thinner, his eyes carrying an apology he hadn't earned yet. "I know I don't deserve to be standing here," he said before she could speak. "I know I left when you needed me most. But I've changed, Bianca. I want to be a father to my son. I want us to be a family again." Every rational part of Bianca wanted to shut the door. But there was another part of her, the part that remembered promising a newborn Daniel that he would never grow up wondering why his father wasn't there, that kept the door open instead. "You don't get to just walk back in," she said. "I know. Let me prove it. Please." Against every warning bell ringing quietly in the back of her mind, Bianca let him prove it. Telling Wonbin was harder than she expected. She found him in the study, the same room where she'd once picked up his cane, and made him laugh with a joke about tea. He looked up as she entered, and something in his face shifted before she'd said a single word, as though he already sensed the shape of what she'd come to say. "I have to give my notice," Bianca said. "Daniel's father has come back. He wants to be part of our lives again, and Daniel deserves the chance to have both parents." Wonbin's expression didn't move. "Then you should go," he said. "You're not going to ask if it's the right decision?" "It's not my decision to question." She wanted him to argue. She wanted him to say something, anything, that would give her permission to stay. He didn't, and she told herself that his silence meant he didn't care as much as she'd hoped. She was wrong. He simply didn't know how to fight for something he'd never allowed himself to want out loud. That night, after she'd gone, Wonbin sat alone in the empty study and understood, for the first time in his adult life, what it meant to lose something before he'd ever admitted he had it. If this story has you hooked already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because things are about to get a lot more intense, and you won't want to miss what happens next. Wonbin might have let her walk away in silence forever, if not for a phone call from a contact who owed him a favor. "The man your former housekeeper's friend is seeing," the contact said carefully, choosing his words the way people do when delivering bad news to someone dangerous. "He has debts. Serious ones. And he's not exactly single either. There's another woman. A child." Wonbin's jaw tightened. "Anything else?" He's spoken to a lawyer. "About custody. It looks less like reconciliation and more like leverage." Wonbin sat with that information for exactly one night before he acted on it. He found Bianca at the small apartment she shared with Daniel, and though every instinct told him to stay out of it, he knocked anyway. "You need to be careful," he said, the moment she opened the door. "Michael isn't who he's pretending to be." Bianca's arms crossed instinctively. "You investigated him?" "I looked into him. There's a difference." "Is there?" she echoed, the same words her friend had once used against her, except now they were a weapon aimed at him. "You couldn't just be happy for me. You had to dig up something to make him look bad." "I'm not making anything up, Bianca. You're only saying this because you don't want me to leave," she said, and the words landed harder than either of them expected, because some part of her already suspected they were true, and she hated how much that truth complicated things. Wonbin absorbed the accusation without flinching outwardly, though something in him folded quietly inward. "If you ever need me," he said finally, "call." Then he left and didn't push again. Weeks passed. Michael was attentive at first. Flowers, dinners, promises whispered to Daniel about vacations they'd take together someday. Bianca wanted so badly to believe it was real that she ignored the small cracks. The late nights he wouldn't explain, the phone he angled away from her, the way he flinched whenever she mentioned finances. The truth arrived the way truth often does, quietly, in a moment she wasn't prepared for. She found a folder of photographs tucked into his jacket pocket while doing laundry. A woman. A child who looked no older than 3. Family photos that had nothing to do with her or Daniel. That evening, hidden behind a half-open door, she overheard him on the phone with a friend, laughing about how easy it had been to convince the single mother that he'd changed, how custody of Daniel would guarantee him access to money he desperately needed. Bianca's chest went cold. Every warning Wonbin had given her replayed in her mind, and the shame of having dismissed him as jealous sat heavier than the betrayal itself. She had chosen the wrong man to trust, and worse, she had punished the right one for trying to protect her. Guilt and fear tangled together inside her chest. She thought of every excuse she'd made for Michael over the past weeks, every warning sign she'd talked herself out of seeing, because believing in him meant Daniel could finally have the family she'd always wanted to give him. She had mistaken desperation for hope, and now she didn't know which version of herself to trust anymore. The woman who wanted so badly to believe in second chances, or the one who had known better all along and silenced herself anyway. She confronted Michael the moment the call ended, her voice steady despite the storm inside her.
"Get out," she said. "Now."
Bianca, wait. I heard everything. The woman, the child, the lawyer. Get out of my home. Michael's mask slipped completely, the charm replaced by something colder. You think you can just throw me out? Daniel is my son too. I'll fight you for him if I have to. Try it, Bianca said, though fear had already begun creeping into her voice. She reached for her phone to call Wonbin, the one person who had warned her, the one person she owed an apology to more than anyone. It rang and rang. No answer. He was hundreds of kilometers away, deep in a private clinic for treatment he'd told no one about, his phone switched off per doctor's orders. Michael saw the panic flash across her face and mistook it for an opening. Give me the boy, he said, stepping closer. Or I swear, you'll regret this. Don't you dare. The argument spiraled fast, voices rising, years of buried resentment breaking loose all at once. You are never coming back for us, Bianca said, her voice shaking but her feet planted firmly between Michael and the hallway leading to Daniel's room. You came back because you thought I'd be too desperate to ask questions. Watch your mouth, Michael snapped, stepping closer than she wanted him to. Or what? You'll disappear again the way you always do the moment things get hard. Michael's temper cracked completely. He struck her. She fell hard against the edge of the table, the room tilting sideways before going dark. Daniel, woken by the noise, peeked from his doorway just in time to see his mother collapse. Michael, panicking now that things had gone further than even he intended, grabbed the boy by the wrist. We're leaving.
Now.
Daniel screamed for his mother. A neighbor 2 doors down, already alarmed by the shouting minutes earlier, had called for help the moment the first crash echoed through the thin apartment walls. Meanwhile, hundreds of kilometers away, Wonbin stepped out of his final treatment session and switched his phone back on for the first time in hours. 12 missed calls lit up the screen, all from Bianca. His stomach dropped before he even listened to the single frantic voicemail she'd managed to leave. He didn't wait for context. He didn't wait for details. He called the authorities directly, gave them the address, and was in a car within minutes, his security team scrambling to keep pace with a man driving faster than caution allowed. By the time Wonbin arrived, the flashing lights of 2 patrol cars already lit up the narrow street. He pushed past a police officer trying to hold the perimeter, ignoring the man's protest, until he found Daniel sitting wrapped in a blanket on the back of an ambulance, tear-streaked and shaking but unhurt. Where's your mother? Wonbin asked, kneeling to the boy's height. They took her in the ambulance, Daniel whispered. She wasn't waking up. Wonbin's hand tightened briefly against his own knee before he steadied himself, forcing calm into his voice for the child's sake. She's going to be okay, he said, though he had no proof of that yet, only the refusal to consider anything else. Michael was already in handcuffs, shouting something about his rights, as two officers guided him into the back of a patrol car. Wonbin didn't spare him a glance. Some men aren't worth the attention of your anger. He rode with Daniel to the hospital, one hand resting steady on the boy's shoulder the entire way. The hospital waiting room tested every ounce of composure Wonbin had built over decades of controlling rooms far more dangerous than this one. He paced. He sat. He paced again. Daniel eventually fell asleep against his side, exhaustion outweighing fear, and Wonbin didn't dare move for fear of waking him. Hours passed before a doctor finally approached. She has a concussion and some bruising, the doctor said. But she's stable. She's going to recover. Wonbin exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding since the moment he saw those missed calls. Can I see her? She's still unconscious, but you're welcome to wait inside. He carried Daniel into the room himself, refusing help, and settled into the chair beside Bianca's bed, the boy curled against his side, both of them finally still. Bianca woke slowly, the room swimming into focus in pieces. White ceiling, soft beeping, a familiar weight beside her that she hadn't expected to see when she opened her eyes. "Where's Daniel?" was the first thing she managed to ask, her voice hoarse. Wonbin's face softened in a way she had never seen before, all sharp edges replaced by something gentler. "He's safe," he said. "He's right here. He's been asking when you'd wake up." Daniel stirred at the sound of her voice and practically climbed onto the bed, careful of the tubes, burying his face against her shoulder. "I thought I lost you," he mumbled. "You didn't," Bianca whispered, holding him as tightly as her bruised body allowed. "I'm right here." She looked up at Wonbin over her son's head, and the words she'd owed him for weeks finally came. "You were right about him. About everything. I'm sorry I accused you of things you didn't deserve." "You don't have to apologize." "Yes, I do. I let my fear of Daniel growing up without a father cloud everything you tried to warn me about. And when you needed me to trust you most, I threw it back at you." Wonbin was quiet for a moment, choosing his next words with the same care he gave every important decision in his life. "I should have answered your calls sooner. If I had." "You couldn't have known," Bianca said. "You were fighting your own battle. We both almost lost something because we were too afraid to say what we actually meant." Neither of them finished the thought out loud. It didn't need finishing. They both understood it now. In the days that followed, Wonbin barely left the hospital wing except when Daniel needed to be taken home to sleep in his own bed. He arranged, quietly and without asking permission from anyone, for a private room, for the boys' favorite meals to appear at the cafeteria without cost, for a tutor to visit so Daniel wouldn't fall behind in school during the disruption. He never mentioned any of it. Bianca found out only because a nurse, assuming she already knew, thanked her for choosing such a generous husband. Bianca didn't correct her. For the first time, the mistake didn't feel like a mistake at all. Recovery came slowly for Bianca, in the way healing always does. Not a single dramatic turn, but 100 small ones stitched together over weeks. Wonbin visited daily, sometimes with Daniel, sometimes alone, always with something small and thoughtful, a book she'd mentioned once in passing, a meal from a restaurant she loved, silence, when silence was what she needed most. His own treatment continued in parallel, and for the first time since his diagnosis, he approached it with something other than grim obligation. He wanted to get better now, not simply to survive, but because he had something worth surviving for. Michael faced formal charges for assault and attempted abduction, along with a string of financial crimes that unraveled once investigators started looking closely at his affairs. Bianca testified, calm and unshaken, the fear she once carried replaced with a clarity that came from finally seeing the truth in full daylight. Daniel, remarkably resilient the way only children can be, returned to school within weeks, his drawings once again filled with dragons, wings still crooked, still, as Wonbin had once told him, capable of winning any fight. Some nights, Bianca still woke with her heart pounding, the memory of that hallway flashing behind her eyes before she reminded herself she was safe, that Daniel was asleep down the hall, that the man who had hurt them was no longer capable of walking through her door uninvited. Healing, she was learning, wasn't a single moment where the fear disappeared. It was choosing, night after night, to trust the quiet instead of bracing for the next disaster. Wonbin never once made her feel foolish for needing that time. He simply stayed, patient in a way she had known men could be, proving with every visit that safety wasn't something you were promised. It was something someone chose to give you, again and again, without needing to be asked. Daniel's birthday arrived on an unremarkable afternoon that Bianca had planned to keep small and quiet, just the two of them and a modest cake. Instead, a car pulled up outside carrying Wonbin, a professionally wrapped gift, and a cake far too large for 3 people to reasonably finish. "You didn't have to do this," Bianca said, opening the door with a smile she couldn't suppress. "I wanted to." The celebration was simple: balloons, laughter, Daniel tearing into wrapping paper with the enthusiasm only an 8-year-old could summon. But after the cake had been cut and Daniel had run off to test his new gift in the next room, Wonbin turned to Bianca with something unmistakably nervous behind his usual composure. "Can we talk? Privately?" She nodded, following him to the quiet of the porch, the evening settling gold and soft around them. "I don't know how long my future will look like," Wonbin admitted, his voice quieter than she'd ever heard it. "The treatment is working, but there are no guarantees, and I refuse to pretend otherwise, especially to you. I don't have a perfect life to offer you. I don't have certainty. What I have is this: whatever time I'm given, I want to spend it with you and Daniel, if you'll let me." Bianca felt her eyes fill before she could stop them, though this time the tears carried none of the fear from weeks before. "I spent so long looking for someone who would just stay," she said. "I thought that meant looking for someone who promised me forever. But forever was never the point, was it? It was always about who shows up when things fall apart. And you think that's me?" "I know it's you," she said, taking his hand. "This time, I'm choosing the man who never stopped protecting us, uncertainty and all." Daniel came bursting back onto the porch moments later, oblivious to the weight of what had just passed between them, grabbing both their hands and pulling them toward the yard to show off his new gift. The 3 of them walked together into the fading evening light, no longer 3 separate stories, but one. Bianca once believed she needed the man who had left her, the one who promised an easy kind of family. Instead, she found the one who stayed even when he had every reason to walk away, a man who once believed medicine alone would determine his future, until love gave him a reason to fight harder than any diagnosis could account for. Sometimes healing doesn't begin in a hospital room. Sometimes it begins the moment 2 wounded people finally choose to trust each other again. If this story moved you, don't scroll past without hitting that like button. It helps this channel reach more people who need a story like this today. Drop a comment telling us which part hit you hardest. Subscribe if you haven't already so you never miss the next story. And share this with someone who believes in second chances. We'll see you in the next one.